So welcome everyone. We're really happy to see you all here. It's been a very good response to this event, and it's part of a series of digital events that's being run by RSVP, the Research Society for Victorian Periodicals. As you probably know, there's a group of us organising these events. That's Prithi, RSVP's Vice President, and myself, Andrew Hobbs. Surav Chatterjee, Katie Birch, Ali Haptachi, Thomas Smits, and we've been putting together this program of digital events. Do keep an eye out for future events. Prithi will mention the next one at the end, which is on May the 17th. So without more ado, I'll begin. And so we're very happy today to have an event featuring 3 editors of the Society's journal, the Victorian Periodicals Review. So we have past editor and 2 previous editors, which will be introduced in a moment. And the rationale of this session today is, as we approach 60 years of the Society, it seemed a good opportunity to look back at the scholarly field of Victorian periodicals as a whole and take a big picture approach. And the idea of today was, it's almost like one of those really high quality review essays that you read to get an overview of the whole field and how it's changing and how it's developing, written by leaders in the field. And so 3 editors seemed a great way of doing that. And the chair for today is Dr. Leslie Howsam, who I'll hand over to in a minute. Leslie is Emeritus Professor of History at the University of Windsor, past President of SHARP, the Society for the History of Authorship, Reading and Publishing, author of various works on the history of the book. She's had 2 book articles published in the journal, in VPR. And her latest book is called Eliza Orme's Ambitions, Politics and the Law in Victorian London. And it's been published open access a month or so ago, so everyone can read it. Okay, so I will hand over to Leslie.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Lovely introduction, and I'm so looking forward to this. I think there's something sort of meta about this event, in the sense that it's the perspective of a periodical editor on the way a field changes is a very specific kind of perspective anyway. But when the field is about periodicals and about editors and others who are, agents in the making of periodicals, there's something just kind of very meta about the editors taking a look at the changes in the field. So today I'm just going to introduce each of the speakers separately, but very briefly. I'm not going to waste our good time on listing all the many accomplishments. You all know how to Google those if you want to. So I'm going to introduce each one just before she appears, but also say these are only the last, I think it's 17 years of VPR editors. There were others before them. As Andrew said, we're coming up for an anniversary of the Society of 60 years, and there's been more than 50 years of a journal. So there's a very long history here. So each of them are going to speak for a few minutes, and then we thought we'd have a short conversation among the 3 editors for them to respond to each other's remarks, and then open it up to questions for everybody. And as usual, I'll put them in the chat or raise your digital hand, and I'll do my best to manage everything. So our first speaker is Dr. Kathryn Ledbetter, better known to us here as Kitty Ledbetter, who is Professor Emerita of English at Texas State University. Kitty was editor for about 5 years, from 2007 to 2012. So Kitty, what do you have to say about the past and present and future of Victorian periodicals?
Well, first of all, I just want to say hello to everybody. It's great to see you all. I haven't been to a conference since Brighton, except briefly to come. So it's been a long time since I've seen a lot of you, and it's just really great. I have lots of wonderful friends here, and it's great to revisit. I've retired from everything except after post-retirement fun. I'm sorry, had to say that. When I started editing VPR in 2007, and I started thinking about the time, that's such a long time ago. It seems like yesterday, but so much has happened with RSVP since 2007. And even after I left, after I turned the editorial job over to Alexis, before she came, we had no money. We had no digitization projects. We had a very close, intimate relationship with Victorian Periodicals research. We had a lot of hardworking scholars, but we had nothing really to brag about internationally. We were pretty provincial, if you say UK and the United States is provincial, but as far as scholarship and the scholarly field was pretty provincial. We had no money. We had, I served in lots of different capacities. I remember when I went to the conference that Alexis held in, what year was that? 2010. I had so many roles that I stood up and sat down and stood up and sat down several times during the business meeting. I was the treasurer, but we didn't have any money to take care of. I had the checkbook. I paid whatever we needed to get the winners of the Rosemary Van Arsdale Prize for Graduate Student Essays and the Robert and Vanita Colby Book Prize. That's all we had. And we didn't have all of the wonderful research opportunities that Eileen Curran, her generous contribution transformed this organization into a small little provincial organization with one person doing all the jobs. I was the editor of the journal. I paid the bills, which were none. I took care of the balance for the checkbook, and I gave these 2 prize monies. That was all I did, but I had several jobs. Now we have opportunities for so many people to serve in RSVP, and I'm so happy about that. I'm also happy that things are staying the same in certain ways, in that we have senior scholars cultivating junior scholars into a sense of good citizenship with RSVP. We're cultivating people to how to do things, how to do research in periodicals, how to, for me, in the beginning, how do you submit an article for publication? What do you do with reviewers? All the things that are basic to editors, I didn't really know that much about when I was in graduate school. And there was no professionalization or no invitation to make the study of Victorian periodicals a tradition or a profession or institutionalizing Victorian periodicals in universities. And now there are lots of opportunities to cultivate undergraduates and graduates into the study of periodicals, since the digitization projects have made that possible. But when I was the editor, we were having this great celebration that Gail was going to digitize periodicals. We were so excited. We had this huge dinner. I think that was when Anne's conference in New York. We had this huge dinner with Gail, and we were so excited because nothing like that was available. Research was so difficult. So obviously, our selection of articles for VPR were much more narrow than they are now, because people can do research from other countries. They don't have to go to the British Library, and the things for the British Library are partially available. I could have a complaint about that. They could do more, but just saying. In fact, I'd like for somebody to get on them about publishing the world. Okay, that said, but anyway, during my tenure, we just had, after Eileen Curran came and did this work for this massive gift for us, who knew that this was going to be so big? We didn't even know it. We just knew that something was coming, but we had no idea it was going to be that much. So I'm so thrilled that someone like Eileen can make such a difference. And here we're all the beneficiaries of that. So generous. And now we have this extensive list of RSVP fellowships and grants to enable fascinating research. So I guess my tenure as an editor of VPR was minuscule compared to the exciting work that Alexis and Kathy have been able to do, because we're so much broader now. We have so many more fields of study. We're expanding into part of what our mission for RSVP was to do the history and culture of Victorian Britain, Ireland, and the British Empire. Well, that part of and the British Empire was really not explored nearly as much as it is now, even though it's one part of our main purpose as an organization. So because it was hard to do research, it was hard to get anything done. And now we've got them on our computer screen, a lot of them. It's a small portion. So I hope that we can continue to expand the digitization projects. I also hope that we will not let our original mission go away in the way of rescuing printed copies and digitizing periodicals that are still in paper, but they're deteriorating and they're going to go away. And if we don't continue research in those kinds of periodicals, they will be gone forever. And we will never be able to get the largest picture that I would like to see of Victorian periodicals and scholarship. So I hope that we'll continue to cultivate junior scholars and students and teach people how to do research in periodicals, and continue to fight for the current index project of anonymity. That's such a bane to our research, and continue to cultivate institutions in institutionalizing the study of Victorian periodicals, so that editors will have a larger selection of works to publish, and of all ages of scholars. And I guess that's the biggest thing, is that I think we all could try harder and take a bigger responsibility in doing that. Serve on committees, no matter what your length of time is as a scholar, and be good citizens for periodicals research.
Thank you, Kitty. That was fabulous. And you've touched on so many of the things that were Andrew tried to suggest when he first thought of this, but also on things that have been so central to RSVP, especially the current bequest. Okay, our next speaker is Alexis Easley. Alexis is a professor in the departments of English and Communication Studies at the University of St. Thomas, which is in St. Paul, Minnesota. She was VPR editor from 2012 to 2018, so about 6 years. I had the pleasure of working with her on an article for the winter 2017 issue, so I can attest to her excellence as an editor. Alexis, would you like to go ahead?
Thank you so much, Leslie and Andrew as well. Priti and Fanula, thank you too for putting this together. But I'd also like to thank Kitty, Kathy, and all of you out there who have worked as editors in the field of periodicals research. Editors truly do keep the great bird of scholarship aloft, to use Margaret Beetham's phrase. This is, of course, also true in the past, and this is where it gets meta, Leslie, because as many of you have shown through your research on a wide range of periodical editors, from W.T. Stead to Mary Braddon, editors are really important historically. So editing VPR from 2012 to 18 gave me insight into the work of Victorian periodical editors. Given how much effort was required to produce a quarterly journal, I was dumbfounded by editors such as Charles Dickens or Eliza Cook, who produced weekly periodicals by hand without computer technology. How did they do it? In 1848, Janet Wills, wife of W.H. Wills, published an anonymous story in Chambers' journal titled "A Monster Unveiled," which was about a woman who becomes the talk of the neighborhood when her husband stumbles home at the crack of dawn each morning. The gossiping neighbors think that he's been carousing, but his wife knows the truth, that he is the editor of a morning newspaper. This surprise conclusion, of course, alluded to Janet Wills' own experience as the wife of a journalist who spent 3 years as an assistant editor at Chambers from 1842 to 45 before signing on as sub-editor of the Daily News in 1846, an editorial position that surely must have found him burning the midnight oil. So serial publication rhythms cannot be separated from the bodies of those who produce and consume them. So as I think about the present and future directions for periodicals research, I'd begin by suggesting that we continue to investigate the complex interplay of visible and invisible actants in the history of Victorian periodical print culture. Not just authors, but also editors, sub-editors, compositors, advertisers, illustrators, engravers, proprietors, and so on. My second suggestion, based on my experience as editor of VPR, is that we continue to think about and write about the methodology of our field. Before I became editor, I often accessed methodological articles in VPR, including Margaret Beetham's influential Open and Close, the Periodical as a Publishing Genre from 1989, Brian Maidment's Magazines of Popular Progress and the Artisans from 1984, and Mark Turner's Time Periodicals and Literary Studies from 2006. So when I became editor of VPR, I was always on the lookout for articles that had the potential to shift the conversation in our field. Thus, in 2013, when I heard Linda Hughes deliver her brilliant paper at MLA titled Sideways, Navigating the Materiality of Print Culture, I immediately reached out to her, hoping that she would agree to publish it in VPR. And after a while, I received that submission back in time to publish it in the 2014 issue. So in my more recent work as an editor for Routledge and EUP, I've noticed that this article is often cited by scholars in our field. And it, like so many other methodological articles in our field, frequently, I suspect, appear as reading on graduate syllabi as well. Indeed, these methodological articles together constitute an informal textbook on how to do periodical scholarship, a collaborative, ongoing text that will continue to be written in the years to come. So two special issues published during my tenure also proved influential. And the first was the summer 2015 Digital Pedagogies issue, edited by Claire Horrocks and Kim Edwards-Keats, which included Bob Nicholson's Tweeting the Victorians and Anne DeWitt's Advances in the Visualization of Data, among many other frequently cited articles. The second special issue I would single out is the fall 2015 Theory issue, edited by Matthew Philpotts, which included off-cited articles by Margaret Beetham, Laurel Brake, Jim Mussel, and Dal Little, among others. These special issues had a major impact on my own scholarship and teaching, and I have no doubt many of you would say the same. The content of VPR is derived in part from our annual conference, as can be seen in our frequent conference-themed issues, but it also has an interdependent relationship with the book publishing industry. During my tenure as editor, I was pleased to publish Sally Mitchell's reflections on the genesis of her book, The New Girl, Lewis James' retrospective on the origins of fiction for the working man, and Margaret Beetham's recounting of the history of a magazine of her own, books that opened up burgeoning fields of research on girls, working class, and women's periodicals. Just as VPR alludes to book publications through reviews and retrospectives, it also provides a springboard for younger scholars, as Kitty was suggesting, to take their scholarship to the next level. To some extent, VPR has always had unspoken partnerships with publishers such as Ashgate, Routledge, Palgrave, Macmillan, and EUP, which regularly publish work that first appeared in shorter form in VPR. For example, I was delighted that two RSVP scholars who published articles in VPR during my tenure, Laura Kassan-Fiss and Teja Barma-Pusapati, published monographs with EUP and Routledge in 2023 and 24, respectively. VPR is and always must be the site where our society's dedication to mentorship and community building becomes most visible and tangible. So in addition to promoting rising stars in our field, VPR is also dedicated to diversifying what we mean by Victorian periodicals. When I began my editorship of VPR, I, like so many of you, was inspired by post-colonial theory and transatlantic approaches, which invited us to study links between British colonial and North American periodicals. A few articles from my time as editor stand out. Amjad Dayan's 2014 article on the Islamic world, Claudia Lee's 2017 piece on the Hong Kong South China Morning Post, Candace Ward's 2018 on the Jamaica Watchman, and Jo-Yoon Jade Park's 2018 study of English Korean newspapers. This focus on colonial English language periodicals represents just the beginning of what promises to be a rich and expansive area of research for many years to come. And looking at recent issues of EPR, I can see that this really has continued under Kathy's editorship. Thank you, Kathy. So Special Issues 2 charted out fresh new lines of inquiry from Will Slaughter's 2018 issue on copyright to Janice Schroeder's 2017 issue on education in the periodical press, both of which charted out fresh approaches and methodologies. The idea of expanding our field to be more inclusive and expansive then and now is in tension with the ways the content of VPR is accessed by students and scholars. For most researchers unaffiliated with RSVP, the content of the journal is discoverable through keyword searches of JSTOR and Project Muse. A special issue on space and place in the periodical press, for example, is accessed by most users less as a cohesive group of articles from the RSVP conference than as individual essays. Reports from Johns Hopkins University Press during my tenure as editor on the most frequently downloaded articles from BPR regularly showed that articles focused on the periodical writings of canonical authors, Dickens or Wilde, were accessed much more frequently than, say, an article on Blackwood's Magazine or on manuscript periodicals. Thus, as at the same time, our field has expanded into new approaches and new periodical genres, this variety is perhaps invisible to scholars who don't attend our conferences or receive print copies of the journal. I comfort myself, though, with the knowledge that an article on Oscar Wilde's journalism, produced from a keyword search of Project Muse, could function as a gateway to our field, just as it did for me as a student of literature so many years ago. I want to close by briefly examining one final area for future research based not only on my time with VPR, but also on my more recent editorial projects. In 2016-18, I co-edited 2 collections of essays for Routledge with John Morton and Andrew King. And in 2019, I co-edited another collection for EUP on women in periodicals with Beth Rogers and Claire Gill. My current edited collection, British Writers, Popular Literature, and New Media Innovation, 1820 to 45, is due out from EUP later this spring. I undertook this current collection because I felt more attention needed to be paid to this earlier period of media history. One of the most interesting thematic threads in this collection is the concept of media ecology, the idea that we must view periodical titles in relationship to each other, how in an increasingly competitive market for print, periodicals differentiated themselves and responded to each other. The addition or subtraction of any new actant affects all other parts of the media system, as Neil Postman has observed. Jenny Batchelor, in her contribution to the book, highlights how the Ladies magazine and competing women's periodicals responded to each other in a dynamic way during the 1820s and 30s, leading to what later would be the identifiable Victorian women's magazine. So I think more work on the conversation between titles within the media ecology of particular historical periods would be great to see in future periodicals research. So I'm going to close it there and hand it over to Kathy.
Thank you so much, Alexis. Just quickly to introduce Kathy, Katherine Malone is Associate Professor of English at South Dakota State University. Kathy's been VPR editor since 2019, which gives her a 5-year record, although I think she should have double credit given that she was editor through the pandemic. So Kathy, we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you very much, Leslie, and thank you to the committee for inviting me. I'm going to focus my remarks pretty closely on the last 5 years, and Leslie anticipates me. It's been an interesting 5 years. I took over the editorship in 2019, and just to keep this in mind, that is a year before the pandemic hit. It's also a year before the Black Lives Matter movement made international news. That's a year before we started talking about undisciplining Victorian studies. So it's all been kind of a bit dizzying. And if you'll forgive me a little tangent, I have to say, or I'll get kind of meta, when Andrew invited me to participate in this discussion, I'm currently teaching the Survey of British Literature Part 2 to my English majors. And we were right around the time that I was communicating with Andrew, we were reading Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Aurora Leigh. And some of you will remember the part where Aurora asserts that a poet must have a double vision, right? To see distant things as if they were near and near things as if they were distant. And I am no poet, but I think that editors need something of that vision as well. But trying to think about these 5 years puts me a little bit in the position of those villagers that Barrett Browning describes, the ones who live in their little town that is actually on a mountainside with a statue carved into the side. So they go about their business, and little do they know that they're planting crops in the eyebrows of this figure, or that cave they're foraging in is, forgive me, a nostril. So, doing this means climbing out of the nostril for a little while, or better, peeking over the eyebrow to see the full figure of where we've been. So I don't know that I can give you the full figure, but I do see something very particular happening. So I'm going to share my screen with you. All right, are you all with me? And by all means, if I've taken over your screen entirely, feel free to go up and press that little button so you can have some control again. But I'm seeing what I think might best be called a self-conscious turn in periodical studies. And so that really means two things for me. One is that scholars are thinking and writing much more than we have in the past about our own working conditions. And two, we're examining the theories and contexts that shape the way that we think and know things, right? And you'll hear echoes of Alexis here when she talks about bodies and methodology. I think I'm talking about something very similar. This self-conscious turn is happening across Victorian studies, but I think it's especially interesting in periodical scholarship because one, thinking about the working conditions of ourselves often dovetails with thinking about the working conditions of the people, of the journalists and publishers and editors who produced Victorian periodicals. And also because this close attention to epistemologies, to the way that we know things, has yielded some really fascinating studies of how periodicals themselves create, promote, and challenge ways of knowing. So I'll start first by thinking about working conditions and what I've seen happening here. It is no surprise that scholars are highlighting the real life problems we face in our own working conditions, from Zoom teaching to the adjunctification of academic labor, union busting, the defunding of humanities programs. We have a lot to think about. We have a lot of difficult work to do. And I recognize there's always been a space to think about these issues. Over on the one hand, we've had the scholarship of teaching and learning. We've published pedagogy articles, even pedagogy special issues. We have another one coming up soon. There's even a whole journal dedicated to the profession, right? But that's on the one hand. And it has often seemed to me that on the other hand, there are the subjects that we research and study, right? Whether that's in literature or history or art, periodicals. For me, it seems like these spaces have traditionally been demarcated as separate. And what's been really interesting is that scholars are now refusing to compartmentalize these issues. So one really recent example, and I will give props to another journal outside of VPR, the most recent issue of Victorian Literature and Culture does a fantastic job of this. It's a special issue dedicated to the theme of Victorianist activism, past, present, and future. And their then and now at the same time in the same article approach it's apparent across the whole issue. But just to give one really great example, Carolyn Botensky and Talia Schaffer have an essay there that examines labor relations in Elizabeth Gaskell's novels as a guide for thinking about the current anti-tenure climate and what allies can do to help adjunct laborers. So this is less meta and more of an intertwining of these issues. In VPR, I think the real turning point in this regard came in 2021 with Jennifer Fegley's special issue on collaboration. which not only examined the collaborative labors of 19th century journalists, but also turned a really thoughtful, critical eye on the work that we do, our scholarship, our teaching. The theme grew out of several really knockout papers at the 2019 conference in Brighton. And some of you will remember there were so many people trying to get into the panel that this grew out of, that they had to bring in more chairs. We started late. I mean, the room was packed. It was amazing. And so I recognized that a lot of these trends that seem to be coming to fruition now, certainly they were happening. The seeds were there well before 2020. But I think that like the global catastrophes that we're living through have given this approach just a lot more intensity. I think the fact that this special issue came together during the pandemic meant that these essays turned into something that they might not have been otherwise. After months of lockdown, Zoom teaching, homeschooling, canceled research trips, it really didn't make sense for the scholars in this issue to ignore their own working conditions. And in fact, Jennifer's introductory essay included this picture that I think sums up like the entire year of 2020 and maybe a little beyond, where we see Lisa Surge and Mary Elizabeth Layton working collaboratively, trying to get it done in the midst of chaos, holding documents up for one another on the screen. I mean, I find this picture was so moving to me, but it really captures a lot of what it means to do this meaningful periodical scholarship. We see this collaborative approach from a lot of angles in the special issue, and Jennifer, of course, does a fantastic job of summarizing these threads in her introduction. But it comes through this focus on work and what it really means to be a researcher in the field of periodical studies. It comes through in the individual contributions. So I'll point to two, and I feel bad name checking anyone without naming everybody in this issue because it's that great. But we see it in Patrick Leary's article about the correspondence between Walter Houghton and Richard Altick in the making of the Wellesley Index. And then later in the issue, we see this come up again in Natalie Houston's counterfactual discussion of the making of the Wellesley Index, or what might have been or could have been the making of the Wellesley Index at a different time. These articles, they give us a window on the past, or what the past might have been. But they're also calling our attention to the kind of labor that we do that makes it happen. So I went back. Sorry, I'd add two before I go forward. And not only because Jennifer's fabulous issue really brought collaboration into the foreground, but I think that collaborative scholarship is absolutely on the rise in our field. I did like a quick count just to see, and VPR has published 16 co-authored articles since 2019, which is a pretty significant proportion of our work. And my reading across the field seems to be showing the same trend. Of course, working collaboratively also feeds the self-consciousness that I've been discussing, because I think by its very nature, when you work as part of a team or with a partner, you're forced to reconsider your methodologies, to identify how you work, and in many cases to adapt how you work. So that focus on working conditions has also yielded some exciting studies of the labor that produced 19th century periodicals and print culture. I'm thinking especially of those scholars who've turned to specialist and trade publications, which we now have better access to, of course, as Kitty points out, because digitization just keeps broadening the scope of what we can study. I think scholars have turned to specialist and trade publications in many ways to consider how periodicals give voice to workers in specific fields or organizations. And I want to name a couple of really wonderful examples from recent issues of VPR, but again, it can't be an exhaustive list. But Mark Neuendorf's 2021 essay on the National Asylum Workers Union magazine and the larger print culture of trade unionism did a fantastic job of exploring the possibilities in these kinds of journals. Of course, Leslie Howsam's 2022 article on the Women's Gazette and Weekly News, a periodical that served as the organ of the Women's Liberal Federation. This is another fantastic highlight. Jamie Horrocks's recent essay on graphic design thinking in print trade journals. And overall, I mean, I expect that, like, this is happening now, but I think as a future trend, I expect to see still more scholarship on trade journalism, if only because, and there may be other factors, but Andrew King's recently published book on work and the 19th century press, and his fantastic web resource, 19th Century Business, Labor, Temperance, and Trade Periodicals, or BLT 19. This is opening up a lot of new possibilities and giving researchers new ways to explore this field of Victorian periodicals. And then finally, I'd mentioned Kristen Konderlich's 2020 VPR article on 19th century debates about vaccination, because obviously this is a great example of how our scholarship speaks to our present work, our present moment. But it also does a great job of showing us how professionals tried and often failed to use periodicals to solidify their authority. So I'll turn to that other strand of this self-conscious turn, which I think is attention to our ways of knowing, to our epistemologies. So anyone looking from the outside can see that really the biggest shift in our field has been the new attention to race and race thinking, both in the text we study and the text we produce. Undisciplining Victorian Studies, the special issue of Victorian Studies, edited by Chatterjee, Christophe, and Wong, started a conversation that is ongoing. We've seen this shift happen in VPR, and it is still happening. Out of curiosity, and this is no solid way to find out just what we've done, but I did do like a quick and dirty MLA search for the terms colonialism, or colonization, or imperialism. Limited it to VPR as the journal title, limited my dates for 2000 to the present, and found that we'd published 28 articles with those keyword hits this century. And again, I don't think that's a firm basis for any grander claims, but I thought, all right, not bad. Right, but the real shift that's happening isn't just that we talk about empire, though we need to talk more about empire. But the real shift, I think, is not just whether we study it, but what texts we read, whose eyes we look through, and what values and assumptions we bring to that research. Those questions now come up regularly in the peer review process. Reviewers have fundamentally changed their expectations so that what looks like a really neat article about women readers or middle-class readers gets a flag from reviewers because they're no longer satisfied to see those labels without some acknowledgement of what race do you mean. So the things that we assume or that go unexamined have really been brought to the forefront. And the reviewers keep me on my toes, right? We're all learning how to do a better job of this. But my advice to authors is to make sure that you've really thought about what group you're talking about. Because of course, this is a development that can only happen self-consciously, right? It doesn't happen by itself. Experience shows us that undisciplining is an active, self-conscious, explicit effort. That's why we launched the Expanding the Field Prize in 2022. We've awarded this prize now to 2 fantastic essays. And I put this slide up because I want to make sure that everybody in this audience realizes that the submission period is opening soon. We are accepting submissions for the Expanding the Field Prize between May 1st and June 15th. And the purpose of this prize is to keep expanding and broadening the scope of what we do. I know that there's some discomfort even with the title of our journal, right? Victorian Periodicals Review. I mean, there she is looming large over our field. In some ways, we want to get beyond Victoria herself. We want to get beyond, we can't ignore Britain. We don't want to ignore Britain, but putting it at the center has left a lot of things unnoticed. So this is one way that we are trying to diversify the geographic, the racial, the ethnic composition of our field. Some of the other standout articles from the past 5 years that reflect our self-conscious efforts, I think include Tara Puri's essay on the Indian Ladies magazine, Tridi Joshi on Mukherjee's magazine, Jennifer Hayward and Michelle Crane Bryce's work on the Chilean press, and Michelle Smith and Christine Maruzzi's work on the colonial New Girl. So we also have a special issue coming out any day now, guest edited by Lars Atkin and Matt Polland on race and transnationalism in Victorian periodical studies. And I can promise that this issue will significantly broaden the scope of who and what we read in 19th century periodical studies, what questions we ask, and what critical methodologies we rely on. But I will also add that this heightened self-consciousness about our ways of knowing doesn't begin and end with our attention to race. This is the most prominent way that it's emerged. But if I cheat a little, I said I had to look at the past 5 years. If I go back about 10, Rita Felske's The Limits of Critique suggested that literary studies, particularly, was too locked into an antagonistic mode of inquiry. And she said about exploring alternative modes of scholarship. Now, I think periodical studies historically has done a better job of not being locked into what she calls the hermeneutics of suspicion, just by nature of our interdisciplinarity and the kind of work that periodicals lead us to do. But nevertheless, I have noticed a wave of articles that are taking up her call to examine more self-consciously our modes of questioning. And so, for example, I think the special issue on 19th century reviews and reviewing, guest edited by Laurel Brake, Finola Delane, and Mark Turner, is a fantastic example of this. And as I was editing this special issue, I just kept thinking, article after article, there were these pull quotes that just were emerging to me. And I kept thinking, my goodness, we're going to be hearing about this for a long time. No one will be able to talk about the book review without looking at this issue. But I'm thinking, so without being able to name everything happening in there, I am thinking especially of Jonathan Farina's essay on Walter Bagehot and cool reading. It's a cool essay, but it reads Bagehot's book reviews in order to track the emergence of the special category of literary knowledge, which is a form of knowledge abstracted from, I'm quoting him, abstracted from and about a literary text, but that is more than just a biographical or historical contextualization of it. These things that we take for granted, we are not taking them for granted anymore. We want to think about where they began and whether they serve us well today. A few other examples of authors, I think, who have shined a light on our ways of knowing and periodicals' ways of knowing. Alison Headley's 2019 essay in the special issue on the Strand magazine examined communications in the Strand. And limiting her study to just one single issue of the magazine, Headley demonstrated how the Strand presented modern information technologies as part of this longer and thus familiar tradition of communication that periodicals had enabled. Lindsay Wells's 2021 Van Arsdale Prize-winning essay on houseplant superstitions and environmental thought gets us thinking about our orientation toward the natural world and human-plant relations. And of course, Claire Stainthorpe's essay on dialogic forms in free thought periodicals is another one that I can't not mention because it reveals how periodical genres like correspondence, debates, forums that are explicitly designed to promote free expression can unwittingly stifle that expression. So articles
Kathy,
like these.
Kathy, we're
wrapping it up.
A bit into question time, so could I ask you to wrap up soon?
Yep, you've got it. I'm right at the end. Thank you. Sorry.
Okay.
So
Sorry.
articles like these, I mean, they're different as they are, and I've tried purposely to go wide here. I think that what unites them is that they're part of an important body of scholarship that treats periodicals themselves as an epistemology. So editorial agendas, layout, typography, seriality, those matters have been the backbone of periodical studies. They're not new, but I think they now look new again through the eyes of scholars who are treating them not simply as components of a periodical, but as meaning makers in themselves. So I will stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. That was terrific. And we'll take just a very short period of time for questions from one editor to the other two, and perhaps also for Andrew Hobbs, who was the person who organized this in the first place, maybe let's start with Andrew's question, since I see you have your hand up, Andrew.
I was actually applauding the three editors. I mean, I do have a question, but I'd rather hear from the three in conversation first, I think.
Okay. So, Kitty, Alexis, Kathy, what do you have to say to each other?
I mean, I could jump in here. I love what Kitty had to say about good citizenship. And just that phrase made me realize just how important this journal has been for so many years and promoting folks who might start as a bibliographer, book review editor. I started as a bibliographer in the way that you sort of like learn these skills. But I'm also thinking of students, you know, that we've had over the years too. And I wondered if Kathy or Kitty would like to comment on that, you know, because that's an invisible group that is really affected by VPR, graduate students.
I feel like that's an opportunity to mention that Van Arsdale Prize is one of the ways, I think, like one of the citizenship moves that RSVP makes. That, I mean, I was a graduate student who found my way at RSVP, and then it was much smaller, but it was so welcoming. It was such a wonderful place to find my way in the academic world. But beyond, even though that we're big, I think we're still that welcoming, and the graduate students in the audience can tell us what maybe we can be doing better. But I think that's always mattered. And the Van Arsdale Prize is one of the ways that we really try to recognize the exciting scholarship coming from new scholars.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, I mean, the first RSVP conference I went to, I think was in 91, around there. And I saw Sally Mitchell in the hall, and I was just stunned. I admired her so much because she worked with students and she brought students to the conferences. And that kind of mentoring can't be replaced, can't be gotten anywhere. And I think we could get undergraduate students to come. It's not just graduate students, teaching them in class. I mean, every English class that I taught at Texas State had something to do with the periodical. I don't think there's nothing you can teach in 19th century Britain without talking about periodicals. And I just brought it into everything. It's not just the Dickens class, you know. That's how I got my idea for Tennyson, the Tennyson book, because he published so heavily in Victorian periodicals. You know, I think we can all see where we could bring students in, institutionalizing Victorian periodicals as a field of study in our universities, in our meetings with colleagues at the universities, on the upper levels of forming classes. You know, asking students to submit an article as part of their, you know, their class work, and then working with them and teaching them how to do research. I think all that thing is the future of RSVP. And we recognized that a few years ago when we tried to encourage new members to be on the board and shift the board membership around. We were concerned that it was getting, you know, maybe too familiar. And I don't think we can afford to be that casual. We've got a lot of money to spend, and we need a lot of people to spend it in the way that we need. That can't be bad for RSVP's future.
You know, the chat is filling up with comments, and Claire Horrocks has posted about working on the RSVP bibliography as one way in for students. And this just goes back to Alexis's point about starting in these earlier positions and finding your way suddenly at the helm of the journal. But I think we all have that trajectory. My first contribution to VPR was as someone who was working on the bibliography under Alexis, who was the bibliographer at the time. And Sally Mitchell, who was my PhD director, had said, you know, you really ought to reach out to the bibliographer at RSVP and see if they need you to cover anything. And it was something very small. What can I do to help? And that's how I got to know Alexis. And then I became the bibliographer. And then as time went on, I became the book reviews editor. And there have been all of these opportunities to serve along the way. And on the flip side, I never felt, honestly, like I was doing something for RSVP. It seemed to me that RSVP was just opening its arms and like bringing me in.
Leslie, you're muted.
I knew that would happen. I'm just asking if anyone else has a question. I'm not 100% sure I'm going to see the raised hands, although I certainly should there. Ann Anderson has a question. Ann Anderson? Maybe she's muted too.
Okay, hopefully
Okay.
I'm now not mute. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Good, good. Okay, so I work particularly on Punch, and I'm fascinated by some of the editors, Francis Burnand and Mark Lemon. And what strikes me, as I'm not specifically a periodicals specialist, I actually come from art history, but at the moment I'm very much engaged in theatre history. And that is that our research is very pigeonholed. So I know you've been talking about transnationalism and globalization and colonialism and all of the other sort of ways in which we're decolonizing. But I still feel that our scholarship is very confined to the sort of subject specifics, so like periodicals. So what fascinates me with people like Burnand is that they are, to use old-fashioned expression, Renaissance men. They've got their fingers in so many pies. Burnand, produced over 500 stage productions of different types. So my idea of broadening the canon, so that was one of the things that you've had on one of your covers that you've just seen on the PowerPoint, is thinking about the broader implications of the men involved in editing, because they are much more than just editors of periodicals. Does that make sense?
Who would like to comment on that?
So I'll sort of follow up with a question. So do you sort of mean like looking at editors, but exploring their other lives, like what the forces that might have an impact on their roles as editors?
Yes, absolutely. The fact that they are embedded in Victorian visual culture as well as written culture, the clubs that they belong to, particularly thinking of the savage and the beefsteak, the way that Victorian society operated. It's such a closely interwoven society that, you know, they didn't go around sort of pigeonholing themselves. But I do feel that scholarship does tend to stick them into boxes. And we don't sort of think about how, if Burnand or Mark Lemon have just had a success on the stage, how that might impact on their editorship of the magazines with which they're involved. I mean, Mark Lemon is another incredibly, a Tom Taylor I'm thinking of in particular, another Tom Taylor, again, another editor who's a very big figure in theatrical history. So whilst I'm very happy to do the gender and race and colonialism, I think another way of making periodicals more interesting to a broader readership is just thinking about the giants of Victorian society who are involved in these magazines. Like I was the one who put up that thing about why is the world not digitized? That's the sort of thing that I mean. And I don't understand why, because truth is digitized. So I don't understand why the British Library won't digitize the world. But it's that type of interaction across so many spectrums of society that these magazines get involved in that I find particularly interesting, because you're breaking down the sort of like divisions, as I think of them, false divisions, between the different walks of society. or the different aspects of Victorian society. And I'm thinking not just that here in Britain, but in our, you know, in our inverted words, colonies as well, like Canada or Australia.
I think
Okay,
one of the
thank you,
problems-
Anne. Oh, sorry, I wanted to move on to another question. Go ahead. Was it Kitty you wanted to speak?
Oh, I just wanted to comment on the editorships. It's difficult to get information about editors because they didn't think their job was that important then to keep archives, certainly. And it's a wide span of sources that need to be considered to get an inch of information. So I knew that working with the sub-editor with Edmund Yates on World. So I think it's one of those little dark places that we avoid because they're difficult to reveal anything.
And one thing I'd like to say
I
too.
know we're getting very close to the end of the time, but I want to give some time to Andrew's question about what's missing from the field of 19th century periodical studies, because, you know, we're seeing lots of celebration in the chat of how wonderful VPR is and can be, and ideas for the future. But you editors, what you know what's missing. You know the things you would have liked to commission articles about, but you didn't get the submissions for. So tell us what's missing.
I mean, something I would say is something I've often thought about when I was editor is, should we go digital completely so that we can have color illustrations so that the issues can like extend over, you know, the usual page range. And, you know, there's a kind of multimedia aspect to publishing too that Anne's question made me think about, you know, the idea of media ecology, the way that periodicals are connected to other material practices, other kind of forms of writing and genres of writing. And so I feel like this media ecology approach could go a long way towards like helping us trace those relationships. And but I wonder if the format of the journal itself as a print product might limit us in that regard. So I'd love to know what Kathy thinks about that.
So I wrestle with it. I mean, when you say this, like there are particular articles sometimes that really show me the limitations of our print format. And when I think about that article on the Punch pocketbook, and when I had to press the button in Photoshop to convert those gorgeous color images to black and white, I mean, it's heartbreaking, right? I mean, there's something to share there with our readership that we simply could not. And on the other hand, there's a long authoritative tradition to having the print version of the journal. And I would really, I mean, when I think you know this, when you're the editor, Kitty and Alexis, right? There's this sense of you want to go into the future, but you're also holding the flame of what those giants before you have built, right? And I'd hate to be the person who took VPR out of people's hands.
I was thinking the same thing this morning. I thought, what is paper edition is nice, but I'd rather look at it where I can expand it and copy pages, and you know, we're used to that. It's the future. Well, it's here, but I think that's a future development for it. And also, well, just it doesn't on that, but I just wish that we could get back to the two coastline conferences. You know, speaking of good citizenship, let's get to some of the younger scholars to organize conferences. One in the United States, or at least the Canada and the United States, and one in everywhere else. I don't mean to be so selective, but we had the last conference that we had was in Kansas City. Jennifer's last conference we had in the United States. We haven't had any volunteers to organize any conferences. So I'd like to see that.
Could I come in, Leslie, just for a second to say that we're working on that all the time, really conscious and working on that all the time. And as a way of ensuring that graduate students can participate when we have repeated conferences on one side of the Atlantic is to increase the travel awards we give to graduate students, and they're substantial. So we're really, really conscious of that all the time. That you know, as well as I have loads of things to say about how fantastic this talk has been, but I'll just shut up.
Kitty's
I
point
hate
takes
to,
us back to the question of graduate students and cultivating new members too. I'll say just briefly, right? I mean, I have these lovely memories of watching Alexis shepherd like 10 graduate students to RSVP conferences, right? I mean, and like the editor should be doing that, and we should all be doing that, but you can't do that when you've got to fly to another continent, right? So getting it back on schedule helps us cultivate that membership. But I'm sorry, Leslie, go ahead.
oh, I was just going to sort of try to draw us to a close because our time is pretty much up. And to thank you all and to thank everybody in the audience, and then to turn it over to Preeti to talk about this from the perspective of the organization, which in a sense we've been doing all along.
Thank you. This is really fabulous, and I think I could stay for another half hour or more, but we are going to wrap up. And so I just want to quickly say thank you to Leslie, thank you to Kitty, to Alexis, to Kathy, and of course to Andrew for putting all this together. Our next event is in a month. It is on May 17th. And there we're going to try one of these experimental things that the digital events came up with, which is pick a periodical. And so Claire Stanhope has picked Secular Chronicle, and a particular, I think it's 1873. You'll see the link to it, where there was a new editor. So we'll get the editor things and illustrations. So Lorraine will get illustrations in there. All of us will have illustrations. And so basically the idea is we all look through the journal beforehand, and then Claire will lead us through a discussion. So you'll get more on that, but mark your calendar for the 17th. And thank you all very much.